She was held at knife point and taken from her bedroom in the middle of the night. And for 9 agonizing months, Elizabeth Smart's disappearance became a national nightmare with no guarantee of a happy ending. Hi, I'm Katie Ring, and welcome to Night Watch. Make sure to hit subscribe. More than 20 years after her abduction, Elizabeth Smart's story is back in the headlines following the January 21st release of Netflix's Kidnapped Elizabeth Smart. To understand what happened to Elizabeth Smart, we have to begin before the night she was taken. In 2002, Elizabeth Smart was 14 years old, living with her family in Federal Heights, one of Salt Lake City, Utah's most affluent and established neighborhoods. Federal Heights was known for its wide streets, large homes, and a sense of safety that ran so deep many families rarely even locked their doors. It was the kind of place where neighbors knew one another, children walked home from school, and violent crime felt distant. Elizabeth lived with her parents, Ed and Lois Smart, her 4 brothers, William, Edward, Andrew, and Charles, and her 9-year-old sister, Mary Catherine. The Smarts were deeply involved in their community and their faith. They were members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Elizabeth was the second oldest child in the house, and friends and family described her as shy, polite, and caring. She wasn't rebellious or impulsive. She was careful and composed with her words, her behavior, and her expectations of herself. But music was a space where she could be bigger than that. She was a gifted harpist and practiced for hours at a time. Her talent was advanced enough that she performed publicly and had already appeared as a soloist at a concert connected to the 2002 Winter Paralympics. At home, life felt smaller and familiar. Elizabeth shared a room with her younger sister, Mary Catherine, and every night the two followed the same routine, talking quietly and reading together, and then turning out the lights. And on the evening of June 4th, 2002, the Smart household felt entirely ordinary. Elizabeth teased her siblings, talked excitedly about a potential trip with a friend's family, and read to Mary Catherine before bed. There were no warning signs, no arguments, and no disturbances. No reason to believe that by the morning, Elizabeth's bed would be empty. In tonight's episode, we will revisit the night Elizabeth Smart was taken and unpack how this case reshaped the way America understands coercion, control, and what survival really looks like. Hi, I'm Katie Ring, and welcome to Night Watch. If you're looking for daily true crime coverage and the stories behind the headlines, you won't want to miss an episode. Make sure to subscribe to my YouTube channel or follow me on Spotify. We have new episodes every weeknight. This episode discusses a criminal case. The information we share is based on what's publicly available at the time of recording and may change as new evidence comes to light. We aim to inform, not to decide guilt or innocence. So everyone mentioned is presumed innocent until proven guilty in a court of law. In the early morning hours of June 5th, 2002, 14-year-old Elizabeth Smart woke up to a sensation she couldn't immediately process. A knife was pressed against her throat. At first, she thought she was just having a nightmare, as a bearded man stood beside her bed and whispered a threat that cut through the darkness. "I have a knife to your neck. Don't make a sound. Get out of bed and come with me, or I will kill you and your family." Elizabeth turned her head and saw her sister Mary Catherine asleep just inches away. In that moment, Elizabeth realized this wasn't a dream, and she made the decision to stay silent to protect her family. The man forced her out of bed and into the hallway, past her brother's rooms, and towards the kitchen door. The Smart home had an alarm system, but due to an installation error, the door the man used to enter the house wasn't actually connected. So when the door opened, there was no sound. And just like that, Elizabeth and the man were out into the night. He led Elizabeth outside and up towards the foothills of the Wasatch Mountains. And with every step, she moved further and further from safety and deeper into the dark. But what Elizabeth didn't know was that someone else was awake. Mary Catherine had woken up and heard the man's voice. She heard the threats, and she stayed perfectly still under the covers, terrified that any movement would draw his attention and put both of them in danger. But once he took Elizabeth out of the room and down the stairs, she crept to the doorway, peeked into the hall, and caught a brief glimpse. Then, before she knew it, they were gone. Mary Catherine waited almost 3 hours before running to her parents' room, paralyzed out of fear that he might come back for her. At 3:58 a.m., she shook them awake and told them Elizabeth was gone. Ed and Lois Smart reacted immediately, and at 4:01 a.m., Ed called 911. Police were dispatched within minutes, and officers arrived at the Smart home shortly afterward. As they began surveying the house, investigators quickly focused on the most obvious sign of entry: a kitchen window. The window was open and the screen had been cut, suggesting someone had come through from the outside of the house. Nearby patio chairs had also been positioned beneath the window as if to help someone climb in. And while officers worked to understand what happened inside the home, Mary Catherine gave the only eyewitness account from the bedroom. She saw a man who was roughly the height of her older brother, so not especially tall. He was wearing light colored clothing and a light colored hat, and was carrying a bag, possibly a backpack or duffel. It seemed like a good lead. But here's the main problem of the investigation. The home wasn't fully closed off as a crime scene until 6:54 a.m. So for nearly 3 hours after the 911 call, neighbors, friends, and members of the Smarts Church all filed in to help and show their support. By dawn, the house was crowded with people who cared about the Smarts, but the crime scene was completely compromised almost immediately. Footprints were trampled, objects were moved, potential evidence was disturbed, and police didn't begin formally tracking who entered and exited the home until hours into the response. Outside, the search escalated. Officers canvassed the neighborhood, K-9 units were deployed, helicopters and fixed-wing aircraft scanned the foothills. But within hours, hundreds of volunteers were moving through the same spaces investigators needed preserved, making it difficult for search dogs to isolate Elizabeth's scent. Teams couldn't determine which direction she had been taken. By mid-morning, the story had already spread, and the search for Elizabeth Smart was underway. First, Elizabeth's face and pleas for her return took over local news channels. Then it went national. Within days, more than 1,800 volunteers joined the search. By the end of the first week, that number would swell to over 8,000 people. And a $250,000 reward was even announced for Elizabeth's safe return. From the outside, it looked like an all-hands rescue mission. But behind the scenes, investigators were struggling. There were still no clear suspects, no confirmed sightings, no physical trail to follow, and as we in the true crime world know, with every hour that passed, the statistics grew more frightening. Law enforcement knew that in the majority of stranger abductions, children are killed within the first 24 hours. Elizabeth had already been gone far longer than that. As the investigation unfolded, police took a new approach and looked into the possibility of the abductor having inside knowledge of the home. The man who took Elizabeth had used one of the only doors not connected to the alarm system, and that detail raised some uncomfortable questions. Could this be someone who knew the house? Or even worse, someone the family trusted? Like in so many abduction cases, investigators briefly examined the people closest to Elizabeth, including her parents. In fact, Ed Smart was questioned early and even took an FBI polygraph. But as the case unfolded, there was no evidence pointing back to inside the family, and attention then shifted outward to people who had worked inside the Smarts' home. And that's when one name rose to the top: Richard Ricci. If you're a mom or just a busy woman like me, finding time to shop when you're juggling work, life, and family can be overwhelming. And searching through rack after rack to find the perfect pieces can be tedious to say the least, if you don't have the time or energy. If you're looking to update your wardrobe in the new year, Daily Look is the #1 highest rated premium personal styling service for women. And it's basically like having a personal shopper and a best friend rolled into one. Here's how it works. You get a real personal stylist, not an app or an algorithm, who curates up to 12 premium pieces just for you, based on your body, your lifestyle, and your personal taste. They arrive at your door, you try everything on at home, keep what you love, and then send back the rest. Free shipping both ways. You can schedule boxes every 30, 60, or 90 days, so it fits your life perfectly. What I loved most is that the quiz is super simple and all of the pieces are handpicked just for you. Currently waiting on my first box, but if you see me in anything other than my typical hoodie or crew neck, it will definitely be thanks to Daily Look. Take your style quiz at dailylook.com and use code CRIMEHOUSE to get 50% off your first styling fee. Richard Ricci was a 48-year-old handyman who had worked on the Smarts home as part of Ed Smart's long-running renovation project. Over the years, Ed had hired several contractors and laborers, but Ricci stood out for reasons that had nothing to do with his work. Ricci had a criminal history. He had dropped out of school as a teenager, joined the Navy briefly, and spent much of his adult life cycling in and out of prison for burglary and theft-related offenses. He struggled with heroin addiction, and stealing was how he got by. Ricci had only been out of prison for about 6 months when he met Ed Smart in early 2001. He was recommended to Ed by another contractor, and Ed trusted the recommendation. Plus, he believed in giving people second chances. Ricci did odd jobs around the Smart home, including carpentry, yard work, and repairs. And when Ed learned Ricci didn't have a car, he even offered him a white Jeep Cherokee as partial payment. But that relationship ended abruptly. In June of 2001, about a year before Elizabeth's kidnapping, Lois Smart discovered that her favorite pearl bracelet was missing. She reported the theft to police, and Ed confronted the three contractors who had been working in the house at the time. Ricci denied taking it and even went as far as saying the police gave him a polygraph test and he passed. But that was a flat out lie. The polygraph test never happened. Ricci was fired effective immediately. So, nearly a year later, when Elizabeth disappeared, investigators remembered that theft and Ricci's access to the house. On paper, Ricci looked like a promising suspect. And when police searched the residence, they found items stolen from the Smarts, including a wine goblet filled with sand from a family vacation, which is strange considering the item had no monetary value, raising some disturbing questions about why he would steal it in the first place. Police also found a machete in a nearby trailer belonging to Ricci's father-in-law, which could be a potential link to the cut window screen. A light-colored hat was also found on the property, matching the description of the hat that Mary Catherine saw the night of the abduction. When Ricci was brought in for questioning, he admitted to stealing from the Smarts, but insisted he had nothing to do with Elizabeth's disappearance. He even provided an alibi. On the night Elizabeth was taken, Ricci said he had gone to work, returned home, cooked dinner, and had over 2 LDS missionaries to tutor his stepson. His wife, Angela, confirmed this, but added that when they went to bed that night, she took sleeping meds, which meant Ricci could have slipped out of the house without her knowing. Police arrested Ricci for a parole violation after his blood tested positive for alcohol. They held him in custody and interrogated him for more than 22 hours. Despite the pressure, Ricci never confessed to abducting Elizabeth. He begged to take a polygraph and he passed, but by then, Ricci was the only suspect police had, so they held on to him. And then the case took a sudden and irreversible turn. On August 27, 2002, Richard Ricci was brought to court for a hearing related to his parole violation. After the hearing, he complained of trouble breathing, collapsed inside the jail, and fell into a coma. 2 days later, on August 30th, Ricci died from a massive brain aneurysm. He was never charged in Elizabeth Smart's kidnapping, and police just lost their number one suspect. They were back to square one. No arrests, no new leads, no explanation for what had happened to Elizabeth. Ricci's death marked 2 months since the search for Elizabeth began, and for the Smart family, hope was slipping away. But inside their home, something was about to change. On October 12, 2002, now 4 months after Elizabeth's disappearance, Mary Catherine Smart was sitting in her bedroom when something clicked. In an interview, she said that she was cleaning her room and happened to flip through a copy of the Guinness Book of World Records. She said, quote, "The page was like a really muscular lady and like a Harley Davidson person. And I was thinking, like, who has been to the house? And who was suspicious? And the name Emmanuel came into my head." The voice from that night, she finally knew where she'd heard it before. She ran to her parents and told them that she knew who had taken Elizabeth. His name was Emmanuel, and the memory traced back to November of 2001. 7 months before Elizabeth was abducted. Elizabeth, Mary Catherine, and their mother, Lois, had been walking near Temple Square in downtown Salt Lake City when they encountered a well spoken homeless man asking for money, and Lois gave him $5. He talked at length about his love of God and religion and introduced himself as Emmanuel. During their conversation, Lois mentioned that her husband was a contractor, which piqued Emmanuel's interest. A few days later, Ed Smart hired him to help repair a skylight and do yard work. He worked for about 5 hours and Ed paid him $40. That was the last time they saw him, and he never came back after that day. Emmanuel was such a brief presence in the family's life that Ed hadn't even thought to include him on the list of people he gave police. Despite this revelation, when the Smarts brought this new piece of information to the police, they actually dismissed Mary Catherine's memory and went so far as to privately discredit the family. In an interview, Chris Thomas, the Smarts PR person at the time of the kidnapping and the author of the book Unexpected, said that police told an outlet that the Smarts were concocting this story to get Elizabeth back in the news and that they had investigated this Emmanuel guy, and there's not much to him, so be very careful. In November of 2002, when a new sketch artist joined the Salt Lake City Police Department, the second composite was strikingly accurate, and Ed wanted it released immediately. But investigators feared that making the sketch public could bring in bad leads, so they urged the family to stay quiet. The Smarts complied at first, and for 5 long months, the Smarts debated going public with the sketch and additional information. But as weeks turned into months, Ed grew increasingly frustrated. His daughter had been gone for more than half a year at this point, and there has been little to no progress in the investigation. On February 3rd, the Smart family held a press conference and released the sketch of Emmanuel to the public. And on February 15th, the Smarts went on America's Most Wanted. Ed and Lois told reporters about the man they had met, the brief work he had done at their home, and why they now believed he was responsible for Elizabeth's abduction. They also publicly stated something controversial. They thought Richard Ricci had been innocent. 3 days later, an employee at the LDS temple named Tom Holbrook saw the sketch in the newspaper, and when he got home, he showed the image to his wife. And to her shock, she recognized his face immediately. When Tom Holbrook showed the sketch of the suspected kidnapper to his wife, she froze. She recognized Emmanuel immediately. It was her own brother, Brian David Mitchell. He was born in Salt Lake City in October of 1953, one of 6 children raised in a turbulent household. From an early age, Mitchell showed signs of instability. As a teenager, he was arrested for exposing himself to a 4-year-old neighbor and spent time in juvenile detention. By only 16 years old, his life was already off track. He drifted into drugs and dropped out of high school. At 19, after his girlfriend Karen Miner became pregnant, he married her, and the couple had 2 children before their relationship collapsed. As a custody hearing approached, Mitchell took the children and fled out of state to New Hampshire, disappearing for about 2 years. While he was living in New Hampshire, Mitchell was heavily using drugs and alcohol. He would later claim that this period ended in a dramatic spiritual awakening after taking LSD, which led him to return to Utah and re-enter the LDS Church by 1980. By 1981, he married Debbie Woodridge, a single mother with 3 daughters from a previous marriage. Mitchell also fathered 2 additional children with her, but that marriage deteriorated as well after she suspected he was SAing her children. And on the very day that divorce became final, Mitchell, then 32, married Wanda Barzy, a divorced mother who was about 40 years old. She was a deeply religious woman and also struggled with mental illness and emotional instability. And by then, Mitchell's faith wasn't grounding him. It was warping into something fractured and extreme. He believed he was a prophet and that God spoke to him directly. He also believed he was entitled to absolute obedience. Inside that marriage, Mitchell tightened his grip, exerting near total control over her. He convinced her he was God's chosen leader, and whatever Mitchell asked, she obeyed. By the late 1990s, Mitchell had abandoned conventional life altogether. He grew out his beard, started wearing robes, renamed himself Emmanuel, and began preaching his own distorted version of the Mormon doctrine. He believed God wanted him to take multiple wives, specifically young Mormon virgins, and Elizabeth Smart would become his first victim. After Elizabeth's abduction, Mitchell and Barzey did not disappear into the wilderness. Instead, they remained in plain sight. They asked for money on street corners, ate in restaurants, and moved through laundromats, libraries, homeless shelters, and public parks. And unbeknownst to everyone, Elizabeth was often with them. They disguised her with wigs, robes, and veils that concealed her face. In public, she was silent. Mitchell repeatedly threatened to kill Elizabeth's family if she spoke, ran, or asked for help. Then, on July 24th, 2002, nearly 7 weeks after Elizabeth disappeared, another girl woke up in the dark to a terrifying sound. 19-year-old Jessica Wright, Elizabeth's cousin, heard a picture frame crash to the floor in her bedroom. When she looked towards the window, she saw a knife blade cutting through the screen from the outside. Someone was trying to break in. At first, police believed it was a prank, but investigators would later allege the attempted break-in was connected to Mitchell. And still, the near misses continued. In September of 2002, Mitchell was arrested on a misdemeanor shoplifting charge and then released. Each time, Elizabeth was so close to being discovered, but kept slipping through the cracks. As months continued to pass, Ed Smart refused to let Elizabeth fade from public view. He developed a relationship with John Walsh, the host of America's Most Wanted. And on February 15th, 2003, the show aired an episode dedicated to Elizabeth's disappearance, this time including Brian David Mitchell's name and photograph. The response was immediate, and police tip lines flooded with calls. Investigators later learned that on the very morning of June 5th, 2002, Mitchell was caught shoplifting near the Smart neighborhood just hours before Elizabeth was taken. This detail helped link Mitchell to the area at that critical time. They also learned he had been arrested days earlier in California after breaking into a church and passing out drunk, and had been released on probation. Once again, he had slipped through law enforcement's grasp, but this time, not for long. On March 12th, 2003, 280 days after Elizabeth was taken, Rudy and Nancy Montoya were driving through Sandy, Utah, and noticed 3 people walking along the side of the road carrying bedrolls and bags. A minute later, a second call came in from Anita and Alvin Dickerson, who saw a bearded man that matched the face they'd seen in the news, the street preacher known as Emmanuel. When officers arrived, they found Mitchell with 2 females. The teenage girl was disguised in a gray wig, sunglasses, and a white t-shirt wrapped around her head. Mitchell gave police a fake name while the girl insisted she was Augustine Marshall, but something wasn't right. As officers separated the group and asked simple biographical questions, her answers didn't add up. And even then, she clung to the Augustine story. Finally, one officer tried a different approach and asked her directly if she was Elizabeth. After a long pause, she gave a chilling biblical reply. Thou sayest. This was Elizabeth's way of saying yes, without fully breaking the rules she had been forced to live under. Elizabeth was taken to the Sandy Police Department, and not long after, her father was brought in. And when he saw her, the distance and fear finally cracked. He held her, and after 9 months, Elizabeth Smart was home. Elizabeth later testified to the brutality of captivity, that Mitchell SA'd her repeatedly, controlled every aspect of her life, and at times restrained her with a cable and chain and tied her to a tree, using isolation, threats, and physical control to keep her compliant. She heard searchers calling her name in the mountains and stayed silent because Mitchell held a knife and promised to kill them if she spoke. He renamed her, isolated her, and told her she was his handmaiden, a servant to both him and Wanda. Elizabeth outsmarted them and survived by observing Mitchell carefully and learning how to manage his delusions. Eventually, she used his belief system against him, convincing him that God wanted them to return to Salt Lake City. That single decision saved her life. Prosecutors were confident they had a strong case, but legal proceedings stalled almost immediately. Both Mitchell and Barzee were repeatedly ruled incompetent to stand trial due to severe mental illness, and as a result, years passed with little legal movement. It wasn't until nearly 7 years later, in 2009, that Wanda Barzee pleaded guilty to kidnapping and unlawful transportation of a minor across state lines. She agreed to testify against Mitchell in exchange for a reduced sentence. And in 2010, Mitchell was finally deemed competent to stand trial. He pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity. On November 8, 2010, Elizabeth, who was 23 years old at the time, calmly, clearly, and without hesitation took the stand. She relived the painful memories and trauma she endured over the 9 months she was held captive. And on December 10th, she finally got justice. The jury rejected Mitchell's insanity defense and found him guilty on both counts. He was sentenced to 2 life terms in federal prison without the possibility of parole. But even as that chapter of this case came to a legal end, Elizabeth refused to let her story end there. She founded the Elizabeth Smart Foundation, became a national advocate for missing children and survivors of abuse, testified before Congress, and helped influence legislation, including provisions of the Adam Walsh Child Protection and Safety Act. She spoke openly about trauma, fear, and survival, pushing back against the myths that had once shaped public judgment. Fear is not consent, and silence is not compliance. And she also built a life beyond the case. In 2012, Elizabeth married a man named Matthew Gilmore. The couple met in 2009 while serving with the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints in Paris. And today she's a mom of 3, raising her kids in Utah while continuing her advocacy work. As Elizabeth continued on her healing journey and raising a family, news broke on September 19, 2018. Wanda Barzee was released from prison, and Elizabeth responded not with anger, but with a warning. In public statements and interviews at the time, she said she was deeply worried about public safety, emphasizing that Barzee had never fully taken responsibility for her role in the kidnapping and remained dangerous, especially to children. She also reiterated the idea that time served alone equaled accountability, and her release is a reminder of how the justice system can fail survivors. And now, more than 2 decades after Elizabeth's abduction, her story is back in headlines once again, with Netflix's Kidnapped Elizabeth Smart, revisiting the case in her own words on her own terms. Elizabeth's story is not defined by what was taken from her. It is now defined by what she has rebuilt and how she's helped others survive. What did you think of tonight's case? Drop your thoughts and theories in the comments. See you next time. If you haven't already, make sure to subscribe to my YouTube channel at Nightwatch Pod. Thank you. It truly helps me out.